Hi everyone and welcome to Data Leaders. This is the very first in our interview series. Let's get started. Hey everyone and welcome to this first in a series, I hope, of interviews for Data Leaders. Now, this first interview is with Jon Cooke from Dataception. Jon's written a great paper on the data mesh, really taking us beyond data lakes. And this interview really is to talk about that paper. We're going to make the paper available also on the website, so make sure you check that out. And I'll provide appropriate links to Jon's site as well, so you can deep dive and get in contact with Jon as much as you can. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's get straight into the interview. And thanks, Jon, a great deal for coming and being our first willing victim in this interview series. All right, let's go. So, hi, Jon, and welcome to this first, actually, in the Data Leaders journey of interviews, actually. We've not done one of these before, so welcome on board, and it's great to have you here. Maybe, first of all, you could just start by telling me a little bit about, yourself and also what Dataception is in just 3 words. But yourself in a little bit more, right? But
yeah, sure. Okay, so yeah, basically, I've basically been in sort of data business, data technology business for probably about 10, 15 years. Then went through the whole kind of data warehouse, Hadoop, in memory analytics type of journey. Worked for a number of consultancies, PwC, and also building data lakes and data products and that type of stuff as well. So yeah, I've sort of come out the other end, just thinking actually there's actually a better way than the sort of centralized lake and the data warehousing. I think a lot of people have been on that journey, and so I sort of formed my company 2 years ago to really kind of address some of the key challenges we've seen with data warehouses and data lakes. And fundamentally, that's what Dataception is all about. In 3 words, we're basically data platform experts. So we've got a data product, a data mesh product, and we are experts in actually building these types of applications.
I like it. So data platform experts, simple as that.
Yeah.
Great. So, today is a reasonably, potentially technical subject, right? But we're going to try and keep it really business focused. And you've written an article, which we're also going to link to make sure people can get access to the more detailed version of what we're going to talk about today and can get into some of the technical detail. It talks about moving from data lake to data mesh, right? And we know some or many actual enterprises are not even mature enough, perhaps, to have even moved fully towards a data lake. So tell me a little bit about what the data mesh, what problem does the data mesh solve?
Yeah, so thanks, Chris. I think it's super important. I think some of the there was an article with the mesh that was published in 2019 by Zamak from ThoughtWorks, and she talks about a number of kind of failure modes, architecture failures for sort of centralized data platforms, so data lakes, data warehouse, that type of stuff. But really, what it comes down from a business perspective, in my mind, it comes down to 2 key aspects: time to market and capability. Now, time to market is really when you're trying to build a new piece of analytics, new piece of insight, or trying to get data into an analytics platform. The time to market can be huge. I mean, I've done some research, and it can actually take some firms 2 months to build something like a BI dashboard, 3 months to do a machine learning model. And if you don't have the data actually already in your data infrastructure, and this is obviously too long, and this should take days and weeks to actually be able to do it. And 80% of the activity is actually not building the analytics itself; it's finding the data, it's understanding, it's the back and forth between the different teams. And Zamak calls this out. She calls it sort of things like siloed and hyper-specialized ownership, which is a very fancy sentence, but what it means is effectively when you build a new piece of analytics, there are different teams that actually operate on different parts of that pipeline. So the team potentially do ingest data into your platform. There's a team to kind of model it and expose it onto onto the platform. There's another team actually to build the analytics, and you get these big backwards and forwards between the teams to understand the requirements. And as I said, this can take weeks, sometimes months. So that's really, I think, one of the key pieces to it. And and also there's a lack of reuse. Everyone builds their own analytics. There's pipelines on there, which will all look very similar, but they're all recreated and reproduced by different teams. So you get this massive cost of basically reinventing the wheel. And also, it's centralized and monolithic. So basically, a typical data lake is even with modern technologies, it's run by a central team. It's basically takes a lot of time for the central team to better understand what the business problem is, that type of stuff. And self-service really is a kind of isn't really there. I mean, what ideally should be happening is the business teams or the analytics teams are better than the business. Say, right, I want to be able to do a piece of ad hoc analysis, or I want to take this external data set, or I want to be able to build a machine learning model. I want to be able to do all that myself without going to these kind of central components, central teams, that sort of stuff. So for me, those are the sort of the key aspects the mesh is trying to solve.
And really, we are really talking about federation of this whole process, right? Moving away from this obsession we've had for years and years of the only answer to this is centralizing everything, right? So this really should give the business what they really need, which is access to the data in a reasonably quick, reasonably efficient way to make the decisions they need to make. Would that be fair?
That's absolutely right. And then one of the key themes in the whole mesh approach actually isn't really a technology approach. It's going from kind of pipelines and ingesting data to much more what they call a data product centric view of the world, where you're creating a package delivery effectively of insight and data for a particular use case. You're not saying we need to hydrate the lake with 100% of our data and then work out what to do with it. It's like, what's the actual business outcome I need to get to, and let me build an absolute package for that piece of work and that piece of outcome. So it's very much, I say, that kind of product thinking, sort of applying the sort of agile, lean product thinking to data and analytics, really.
So really using the data you need when you need it for the outcome that you're trying to achieve, rather than trying to create something monolithic that might be used in 5 years' time, perhaps.
Absolutely, no, absolutely, yeah. I mean, we've all been broken on the back of we want 100% of our data from the enterprise into the lake. It's like, well, what are you going to use it for? And what does 100% actually mean? Does that mean all the archives? Does that mean it's transactional data? Absolutely, but what else? But it's trying to get away from that. So trying to get to that delivery focus, that outcome-based focus, in my mind, anyway.
Great. So, I'm a fan of acronyms, John, and when I read your piece, I came across an acronym I wasn't aware of. What does MPP mean?
Right, yeah, so MPP is massively parallel processing, and it really refers to basically relational type databases and data warehouses where they're applying SQL queries on data that's too big to fit in one server. So fundamentally, you're taking, I've got a 10 billion row table that sits over 5 servers on disk, or in modern Snowflake type architecture sitting on blob stores and stuff like that. And I execute a query, and it federates it over a number of servers to actually execute that query. That's all it really means. So.
Right.
So it's really a big sort of massively parallel database engine, really.
Massively parallel processing. All right, that's another one to add to our acronym dictionary, I think, for sure. So you address a number of issues with the data lake architecture in this article. So we're really saying, well, perhaps actually data lakes are a little bit something of the past, and we really need to move our thinking to a new paradigm. A lot of the proposition appears to be changing the nature of the user requests, with lots of small requests that don't necessarily need enterprise data lake to support. So, like we said, that federated situation. Do you see data warehouses continuing to be part of that architecture, or even perhaps morphing into a more modern environment like Snowflake? Would Snowflake or something else like that exist as part of the data mesh, or even the data lake? Would that be part of the data mesh?
So that's a very good question. There's a lot of I've been involved in a lot of discussions around this at the moment. I think one thing we need to first do is disambiguate between the architecture pattern called data warehouse and the data warehouse type technology. So data warehouse technology would be a Snowflake, would be a BigQuery on modern SaaS kind of cloud based, or even a Presto Trino for data virtualization. It's that type of thing. But in my mind, the data warehouse architecture approach, where you're ETLing data into bronze, silver, gold tables, then into a central schema, and then potentially putting a master or cube on top, or a BI, and then a BI tool. That, I think, is actually something we're trying to move beyond, because fundamentally it's brittle, it takes time, that sort of stuff. So we do have a lot of people actually in the industry who are actually building meshes on top of things like Snowflake and BigQuery and stuff, but they're really only using them as a storage and query engine, as opposed to that central modeling and that central kind of ETL piece. So if you take a data product thinking, or data as a product thinking, which is another way of encapsulating a complete data set for a use case, you can use any storage mechanism you want, really. And that could be Snowflake underneath, it could be blob store, it could be Spark, it could be anything. But the idea is it's that data, if you get that data product thinking, it's use case driven, you're going away from that kind of central, let's get everything into the warehouse, the lake, that type of thing.
Yeah, and I guess as you move away from those things, some of their functionality reduces. I'm assuming in that context because you start using the data mesh for some of those capabilities, and those two things. We have to find a way for those two things to coexist in some way. Certainly in the interim, as we move on to the next paradigm of technology, realistically.
No, that's absolutely very true, and I think I don't see Snowflake, these sort of big queries, these technologies. People love them. They're very good technologies, and I think it's just about using them in the right way. The mesh doesn't prescribe the actual technology that you use, and quite interestingly, it's quite the opposite. When you go into data products, potentially data products could use completely different technologies, but they share a common way of actually building these products, these data sets. They share things like common security, common policy, that type of stuff. But it's really in the hands of the person building the analytics to define what data technology they want to use it. Now, obviously, in a large organization, you don't want to be completely Wild West where every product has a completely different stack because there's a governance issue around there. But conceptually, if people want to use Snowflake or BigQuery or Redshift or whatever, for each product, then as long as they're building product-oriented data sets and analytics, I think that's proven that's fine, and that's proven to be very, very useful. Like people like Zalando and DPG Media, they've all actually built on top of those technologies very successfully.
Yeah, very interesting. I think you use a great analogy actually in your paper. You talk about it as a media player. So you get people to kind of start to think, well, I'm a consumer now. You forget about what's behind it. This should be relatively easy. Can you talk a little bit about how the user experience might change in a data mesh environment versus today's current environment, whether they're using a data lake or a data warehouse or Tableau or whatever they're using today?
No, absolutely. So I think this, I use the sort of, media player or app store, that kind of thing, where the data mesh is the infrastructure, the app store, the Spotify, that type of stuff, and the data product is a song or an app on the app store. The user experience, I think, is super important, and the first thing it's got to be, I think, in my mind, is the self-service aspect of it. We touched on it a bit earlier. So if I want to go and find an app in an app store, I just do a search and then spin it up on on my media player. And obviously in the mesh world, that could be a cloud or it could be a desktop or what have you. But that's the first thing. I can go and find things that I need really super easily. So we talk about the catalog, not just being of data, but of products in there as well. That's super important. And then for people building the analytics, the user experience has got to be really, again, self-service. I want to be able to go and test out the data, for instance, before I actually do a full onboarding session. I've talked a lot about this over the last few years. So imagine I want to go to get some external data, but I don't really know how good it is, that type of stuff. I should be able to spin up a sandbox, point the analysis tool of my choice in a completely kind of sandboxed off environment, run the experiments and run whatever I need to do and see the outliers, see the data quality, all that sort of stuff, and then go, oh, if I like it, then go through an onboarding process. And very few data platforms actually allow you to do that. So that's super important. And then obviously, as I say, the catalog, and basically anything I do on it gets published back in the catalog. That's not just data sets, that's policies, that's products, that's kind of outputs. Feature stores are a big thing at the moment with machine learning models. So 5, 10 machine learning models, they all do use different features. I want those, not just the models to go in the catalog so I can run them, but I want the features to be able to go into the catalog as well, so I can find them and reuse them as well. So those are the sort of things that that I think are really super important around the user experience. And I guess there's also one more thing around sort of be able to use the tools of my choice. You don't want to just dictate. You just use a thin, narrow set of tools that's governed. I want to be able to use an Alteryx or a Tableau, or I want to bring on a new framework, I want to use Dask instead of Spark and that stuff. So you need to be able to actually have the infrastructure to support those new kind of technologies on there as well. I think that's
well, that can be incredibly useful, particularly for companies who have been through multiple acquisitions where there is actually no enterprise-wide kind of technology policy on what tool you need to use. The interoperability then becomes a problem, right? So you need a simple way to connect to the data mesh or whatever the underlying data architecture is. And I think you touched on something there, but I was thinking, at the beginning of our conversation, I can just imagine that anyone who's listening to this who sits in a data governance role is kind of tearing their hair out saying, I don't want to lose control of this data. I at least know where it is and it's properly organized, and I know who my owner is and my steward. And I think, when they read your paper on this, they'll start to realize that the catalog forms like a central component of what you're trying to do. But perhaps can you talk about how that works from a kind of an ownership and a governance perspective, try and put our data governance leaders in a bit of a more comfortable seat?
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we talk about the mesh being kind of federated execution and delivery, but centralized kind of policy and governance. So the idea is that, you know, the catalog. You're right. I think for me, this is the core of the governance piece. So everything on the mesh is actually in the catalog in some way, shape, or form, and it's got a clear owner attached against it. And this is just obviously just metadata and associating it with that follows the governance structure. Zhamak also talked about data product managers, which is something there's a lot of discussion around, which is quite similar to something having like a product owner for in the agile type world. And I think the ownership is super key. So when I basically bring on a new data set, or from a transactional system, or I build a product, or I apply a data quality rule, the ownership is actually with the person who owns the product. And Zhamak talks about this domain orientated products. Fundamentally, it's owned by a business. It's not owned by a tech team. It's not owned by an operations team, unless it's an operations use case. Yeah. Excuse me. That is super important. But then it's all reflected in the catalog. So I can go and find a data product, find who the domain is and who the owner is. Ultimately, that's got to be a business owner, not a technical owner. And all the artifacts that go along with it are inheritable, that sort of stuff, and it's all provisioned and permissioned and with policies on that as well. So I think the catalog really becomes effectively the replacement for the schema in a data warehouse. The data warehouse schema is really around organizing data. Actually, you take that out and put that into a catalog, you get a much more flexible approach. You can change, you can cope with change, so you don't have to worry about schema changes, that sort of stuff, from a schema and write perspective. But the catalog becomes that central focal point for all those sorts of things.
And how much of a change is that for organizations that may have already invested in things like Informatica, Axon, or Calibra, or one of the other sort of data governance platforms? Can they still keep those as metadata stores within a data mesh, and still keep the governance type components of those, or will they have to replace those for newer technologies going forward?
So that's a very, very interesting question. I think, the data catalog, these are very powerful tools, and there's a lot of, huge amounts of time and money invested in these things, and they're very, very sophisticated. And I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I think, a lot of companies do actually bolt on catalogs on top of it, and but they tend to be more kind of business orientated catalogs. I think that the point I'm trying to make there is really that one of the things I've seen is when you're building analytics, I want to go and find stuff, and I want to publish stuff in there from a technology perspective. So when you've got data analysts, data scientists, developers, that type of stuff, they don't tend to get involved too much with the actual catalog. They tend to go off to a separate team. And I think that's one of the challenges with an offline catalog, is actually having that, the development cycle, test cycle, actually, it's got to be included as part of that. So if they are used, and I think there's lots of capability in there, it needs to be part of that, and the user experience needs to be part of that. So if I want to go and find a new data set, or I want to create a new dashboard, can I go to the actual catalog and find all those things, and then pull them into the analysis tool that I'm using really quickly and easily, and that sort of stuff. So that was kind of low friction, as I call it, dev test cycle, I think, super important.
Yeah. So I guess, when we think about the future, and we think about a data mesh future, I think, we've probably got sort of centralized teams kind of now starting to worry, hey, what does my future look like? How do you think that's going to change the organizational structure in organizations that might have built, reasonably significant central teams, both in technology and in the data space? And how much of that will still need to remain in the future with data mesh?
And that's, again, another very good point, and a very interesting discussion at the moment. We're having again in the data mesh community. I think if you take the strict wording of the paper that was put out, the data mesh team is effectively a business agnostic team. It's a bit like going to a cloud provider, going to AWS, GC, Google, or Azure, or whoever, and saying, and they're providing basically a PaaS, a platform as a service, and you build your business tools and business applications on top. That's what the paper actually says. But for me, I think it's not that clear cut, because it really super depends on your organization, fundamentally, and the maturity of that organization. And some organizations are built around their platform, like the big tech giant. They've done that from scratch. So they've got that fully integrated their org. Most organizations aren't like that, unless they're very small. So I think fundamentally, if the idea is that your data platform team is providing those technology services, and then the business teams are then building the applications. But for me, what you've got to do is basically you've got to get that product thinking. So you've got to differentiate between business agnostic services, things like the security model and all that kind of stuff, and the ability to run pipelines and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But actually, and the business applications themselves, which have got to really be owned by the business. And now, if you have a central team that has a kind of, you've built these virtual teams, and I've seen this before, where you have central teams which are seconded into the business teams to build those applications. I think that actually can work.
Yeah.
But it's got to have the ownership. What we want to try and avoid is basically the business asking for requests. So give me it's an analytics request, fire it over for the technical team. Oh, that's your problem. It's not. I don't own it. I don't. You've got to deliver that. It's not my thing. I think that's what we're trying to avoid.
Got it. Clear. So there could be some change. I guess it's going to depend on how the organization works, right? And what the operating model might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the product thinking is the key for me. It's basically it's orientating that cultural business. It's not about, we're chucking data into a lake and then building a pipeline. It's basically we're building an actually end product that the business owner actually can see. And ideally in the mesh, you could basically, the business owner can fire up a dashboard, see all his products or her products, right? Fundamentally and they own it, they understand. And if there's a red flag on there for monitoring, that it comes up on their dashboard and say, right, let's go and fix it type stuff. So
perhaps the driver is actually to what extent they're already in that kind of data product thinking. If they're already there, then they're going to have elements of what's going to make the data product work. And I guess as part of that, you're going to have, what is the relative maturity of the organization? What is the data literacy within the organization in terms of adoption? And therefore, for some organizations, this could be a leapfrog moment. It could be an opportunity to kind of, I'm halfway through implementing a data lake. Maybe I should be thinking a little bit further beyond that to adopt, new technologies, or some other. It depends, I guess, on what problem they're trying to solve and how mature they are along that journey. Which I think takes me to the next question, which is, there are still a lot of, consolidation type use cases. They're not all kind of small use cases that exist at the edge or at the business edge. There's, finance and risk and other capabilities that need, massive data consolidation. Does the data mesh support those use cases, or are we back to the data warehousing, data lake type component when we talk about those use cases?
No, that's a really good question, Chris. I think, having been through a number of risk and finance consolidation programs myself and seeing how painful they can be, I think the key to that is really, again, is kind of this product thinking, the product being an outcome. So fundamentally, if you're talking about a risk type data product, so maybe you're doing your value at risk calculations, and that when they want to spit out a load of risk metrics around that, or you're doing sort of finance, your sort of P&L kind of attribution, that type of stuff. These could be different products, and if you're looking at a product that actually crosses those domains, it's just another product, really, fundamentally. So you could have one that, looks at your CVA, which might have some risk and finance kind of aspects to it. It's a product, and it might build on those other products as well. So it might actually sit with the risk metrics coming from your market risk. You might have some stuff coming from your finance, your ledger, that type of stuff. And you build a product on top. And really, whoever owns that requirement, fundamentally, to build that from a business perspective, effectively owns the product. So you're getting away from these kind of siloed data platforms, from risk and finance, and trying to join the ETL things in between and that kind of stuff. You're building actually a product, spinning up as an encapsulated delivery, and it will take data from those other products as well. So I think actually, if you can get into that kind of product thinking, the organization boundaries actually start to matter less. It's really around the delivery team, around building that product.
Yeah, so once again, if those teams are already in that data product space, then actually probably more straightforward for them to adopt an approach to it. Right? That makes sense. So my penultimate question, John, is probably my toughest one, right? Which is, how would an organization actually go about implementing a data mesh architecture? That's probably not so difficult because you've got direct experience of it. But perhaps most importantly, what's it going to cost them?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it also depends on kind of how much capability you want to build in from day one. To basically get the hardest bit's actually moving to that product thinking. That's really a culture kind of training, kind of that sort of stuff piece. But if you manage to achieve that, and you start really simply, like maybe you do have a load of data in a data lake or a data warehouse, and use that as an input into the mesh, you then get people to start building products fundamentally, and then you're wrapping the catalog on top of that. And if you use existing open source or existing catalog system, that's actually probably not a massive outlay. You're probably looking at a few months to be able to do that. Yeah. It gets you a little bit away into that kind of the mesh type of thinking. But obviously, if you want a full-blown capability where you have a unified security and all that stuff, and you're building it yourself, I mean, you should be asking the Zalandos and this of the world. You're probably talking about quite a large program to do that. Obviously, there will be tools and shameless plug that we have one as well, that to actually start consolidating our stuff, which you use on a SaaS model, which is actually obviously very cost effective for you. But if you're building it yourself, there'll be quite an engineering outlay to actually get that piece. And then there's obviously the commitment which you need from the senior management to say, actually, we're now building cross-domain products, fundamentally, which is a big one. That can be quite political and quite, actually who owns what and that type of stuff. So that's actually probably almost a bigger challenge than an engineering challenge in my
sure. Yeah, I always say, the technology's there usually to do these things. It's the people that are getting in the way, right? So it's that cultural change. So this can, I guess, if I can paraphrase, John, the reality is you can do this small and you can do it quick, and it's not going to cost you a huge amount of money. It's going to cost you something, clearly, but the cultural change is relatively contained in that case as well. The broader you get, the more complexity, and therefore not only the more tools, but the more people as well. So,
and the more different types of analytics you want to put in. So if I want to do a graph analytics, I want to do stochastic kind of Monte Carlo, and I want to bring all that in, obviously then the costs really start spiraling up as well.
So look, this has been fantastic, John. I really appreciate it. This is a fascinating topic. I don't know how many of us have spent time really looking at data mesh, and I'm sure many more of us will do now. We're going to make your paper available to everyone as well, just to make sure that everyone who's going to get incredibly curious about this knows how to reach out. How would you suggest, A, they get more information around this, and secondly, how would they contact you if they wanted to talk to you directly?
So obviously contacting me via LinkedIn, and also Jon Cooke at dataception.com. That's JONCOOKE at dataception.com. There is also a data mesh group in Slack, and obviously contact me, and I can certainly forward those details. And there's a really good community, a lot of really good discussion. If you want to sort of learn more around the community, that sort of stuff, that's super. And Zamak's on that as well. So.
And is that community more technical or more business driven?
It's pretty technical, has to be said. It's a pretty technical. Obviously, if you want to know more about the business side of it, absolutely contact me, and I can certainly go through kind of my views around the business aspects of those as well.
Perfect. Well, look, John, thanks for being a willing victim and being the first interviewee on the series. So I really appreciate you coming on today and sharing the information you have around data mesh with us, and we'll make sure that people get hold of the underlying information that you've been greatly generous to produce and make available to everybody. So thanks again, appreciate it, and look, have a fantastic weekend, and we'll be back in touch, and make sure you help people if they come on the LinkedIn group and ask us questions about this. I'm hoping that you'll be able to pick those up for us.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure being on.
It's a pleasure, John. All right, take care. Thanks a lot.